So we're on our final part of our series, Walk This Way. And the title we have today is kind of an unusual one. It's kind of a funny phrase. My pack is heavy. Now, if you've ever gone hiking, if you hike long enough, your pack gets heavy. That's just kind of a reality. And it turns out that although it sounds like a funny title, it's actually a phrase that's actually very meaningful in my own life. And it actually comes from many years ago now, before I lived in New Hampshire. Before I lived here in New Hampshire, I used to live in New York City. Don't hate me. Right? I lived in New York City for a long time, 11 years. And I used to come to New Hampshire a lot when I lived in New York City. Is that I'd come up to do the things you can do here that you can't do in New York City. You can go rock climbing here, ice climbing, hiking. So I did a lot of trips up to New Hampshire. And because I went so often, I didn't always go with the same people. I would go with different groups of people at different times. Sometimes large groups, sometimes small groups. But there were two of us that were kind of obsessed. Shocking that I'm obsessed, right? There were two of us that were obsessed, me and my friend Steve. So no matter who else was going or if no one else was going, me and Steve would come up here to do the stuff we would do. Steve and I were friends for a number of years, and because we did so much hiking together, we spent a lot of time together, and that's a lot of time to talk. If you've hiked through the White Mountains, that's a lot of time to talk as you're walking along. And so one of the things that we kind of came to the conclusion of is that, you know, when we're out doing this stuff, complaining makes no sense. Right? Is that, first of all, you're supposed to be having a good time, but even so, how does complaining do anything? Because if I'm uncomfortable because it's cold, if I go, I'm cold, Steve's like, I know, I'm cold too. Right? Or if Steve goes, my feet hurt, we've been walking so long. I know, my feet hurt too. So there's no information to be shared by complaining. So we had this agreement that we just wouldn't complain. And then we had this one trip that put all that to a test. We were doing a 3-day loop through the presidential range. Right? So what that means is that you park your car, you take everything you need for 3 days on your back, and you start walking. So that's all your food, that's your tent, that's your sleeping bag. That is literally everything you might need except actual water, because you can filter that along the way. And we even thought it'd be a neat idea on this trip to take a little bit of climbing gear with us. Now, climbing gear is light, but if you get enough of it, it's not light anymore, right, sort of thing. And the weather had been forecast to be beautiful for the weekend, so we load up, we head out, and we're going through the presidentials. And we sleep the first night, and we wake up, and the weather has changed from the forecast. It is now much colder than they said it would be, and it's now raining. So it's cold and it's raining. And it's pretty clear this is how things are going to be. So there's no reason to continue the loop. There's just going to be nothing to do. So we decide to start heading back. But we are a full day from our car. And it's cold, and it's wet. And remember that we've agreed not to complain. So that means we are walking for hours, not talking. Because the only thing to do is complain, right? So we're walking and not talking and walking and not talking. And we're actually at tree line. We're actually at the trails that are just above adjusted tree line and go up and down. So the wind's blowing. It's horrible. It's horrible. So we finally kind of break back below tree line. We sit down to take a break. And we kind of go, you know, I don't want to just complain. But sometimes when you feel really bad, you just want to be heard. You just want to say something. So we kind of talked about that. We said, well, you know what? These packs are really heavily loaded for what we're doing right now. So if you want to say my pack is heavy, that's okay. Because and our logic in this moment was, that's a statement of fact. That's not complaining. Right? So what happened is we said, well, saying my pack is heavy is okay. So we'd load back up and we'd head out. And as you start to feel miserable, I'd go, man, my pack is heavy. And Steve would go, yeah, my pack's heavy too. And oddly, that became acknowledgement. I don't feel good right now. And he's like, you know, I don't either. We don't have to go on about it, but we're both in the same boat, and that's okay. And so that became kind of a phrase that we used for years. That anytime we were on a long trip, as things started to get hard, or as things started to get uncomfortable, one of us were always free to say, my pack is heavy. And the other one would acknowledge that and say, yep, so is mine. And so that phrase kind of meant to us, it's like, I don't really feel good right now, but I'm going to go on. I'm going to keep going, even though I don't feel good right now. And that's the focus of our message today, that there are times in our life where we're on a long journey, and it's a good, worthwhile journey. But that trip is becoming difficult, and carrying on starts to become difficult. And the thing is that's so easy for it to happen, so easy to happen to us, is that as the journey gets difficult, we can lose sight of the good things that are happening along the way. It's kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week, where if we only look at the outcome at the end, we lose the joy of the journey. And although the journey may be difficult and really uncomfortable at times, it doesn't mean that the journey is bad. And so I think it's really important that we all have this opportunity to kind of say, you know what? My pack is heavy, right? I'm uncomfortable right now, but I know this is part of something bigger, and the bigger is worth it. The being uncomfortable is okay because it's still worth it. And the being uncomfortable doesn't mean that nothing good is happening along the way. It's just difficult right now. So we're going to actually build on the story that we talked about last week. Now remember that last week our focus was on the fact that the story of our lives is built one decision at a time. That our good outcomes and our good stories are built one step at a time. And as part of that, we talked about this man named David. Right? David is one of the more famous people from the Old Testament. And David had this kind of complicated life, but really interesting life. As you recall, David was told at a very young age that he will be the next king of Israel. But he has to wait. And for David to have heard that would have been an amazing thing. David was a very poor young man. He was a shepherd. Shepherds was not a well-respected profession. So he would now one day be king. But he had to wait for King Saul to die. Now he had the opportunity in the narrative we looked at last week to jump to become king. Right? He could kill King Saul, and then he would become king. But then that would have been part of his story. His story would have been he was the king who became king by killing the king. And David kept that in mind. And David refused to take that shortcut. He recognized that that one negative action would be part of his story forever. And he wasn't willing to do that. And because he refused to take that action, it meant that he had to continue to wait to be king. Remember that David was living on the run. King Saul wanted to kill him. Refusing to kill King Saul meant that David would have to continue to live on the run. So David and the men who are following him now are continuing to be on the run, because the narrative we're going to look at today happens even later than the one we looked at last week. And remember, they were already getting tired of being on the run. So they are now more tired. And as they're on the run, they have to move a lot, but they don't have to move all the time. They do have the option to kind of settle down and set up camp periodically. And the narrative we look at today, David and his men have done that. They've set up camp. The key thing they have to watch out for is that they just got to make sure they don't run into King Saul or any of his soldiers, which means they stay away from big cities. They stay more out into the desert or close to small towns. And what David and his men have done is they've set up near a town in Israel called Carmel. And it's a smaller town, but there is a wealthy man that lives there. A wealthy man named Nabal. And what happens here is that as David and his men are kind of hanging out in that area, they get to know the shepherds who work for Nabal. Because remember, as a wealthy man at that time, doesn't mean he has big bank accounts. Generally what it means is he has lots of livestock. And in Nabal's case, he had literally thousands of sheep. And as David is there camping and hanging out with the shepherds, he finds out that this is a really special time of year for Nabal. This is sheep shearing time. Don't get all excited at once. Right? But it turns out that in that culture, sheep shearing time was a huge deal. Because I didn't know this, but sheep are normally only shorn once a year. Right? So what that means is that all the work that Nabal's men have been doing all year, which would have been cost, right? Cost to feed these men, cost to feed the animals, cost to care for the animals. All that money that's being spent is now about to turn into income. Right? This is big money day for Nabal. So understanding that, David realizes that, well, maybe I can build a relationship with Nabal. Because in that culture, what would have been very normal to have happen is that as Nabal's men are doing the work of collecting the wool from the sheep, Nabal would then have kind of big festivities. They would have tons of food, lots to drink, kind of party and just kind of celebrate that this is that good time of year. We made it through another year. The money's coming in. Let's celebrate all that. So that's the whole setup to what we're going to read next. So if we take a look here. So it reads, when David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep, he sent 10 of his young men to Carmel with a message for Nabal. Peace and prosperity to you, your family, and everything you own. Now let's think about this. If you're Nabal at this moment, you're a wealthy man, all the money's coming in, a bunch of strangers walk up to you and give you a greeting like that. What do you know? They want something. Right? They want something from you. Right? So Nabal's going to immediately go on guard when he hears this greeting. So as we read on. So David's men continue. I am told that it is sheep shearing time. While your shepherds stayed among us near Carmel, we never harmed them, and nothing was ever stolen from them. So basically what David's men are saying is that, hey, you know what? We were out there with your workers, we were hanging out with them, and we were great guys. So maybe you want to give us a little something for being such great guys. So they continue on. So ask your own men, and they will tell you this is true. Here it comes. So would you be kind to us? Since we've come at a time of celebration, please share any provisions you might have on hand with us and with your friend, David. Nabal's probably not going to receive this very well because he doesn't know these men. But it turns out that, although to us, that request can actually look kind of odd, right? It looks almost like a shakedown, right? That, that they come up and go, hey, we didn't mess up your stuff, so do you want to give us a little something? I remember when I was younger, the first time I read that, I had the picture of the mobsters, like walking along, going, and if you don't want your restaurant to burn down, you might want to give us some money on Thursday, sort of thing, right? But that's not quite how this went down. Because again, culturally, life was much more communal. Right? We're talking about roughly 3,000 years ago. And so it would have been much more communal life. And there were the very wealthy people and kind of everyone else. And so what would happen is that when a wealthy person had a celebration like this, it would be common for them to share with other people from the area. Right? So the poorer families that are around, of course, his workers and their families. So sharing would have been normal, but sharing with 600 complete strangers is a little bit outside of normal. So what is Nabal going to do with this? What is Nabal going to do? So Nabal responds, and he doesn't really give them the answer that they're looking for. Nabal says, "Who is this fellow David?" Nabal sneered to the young men. "Who does the son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters." So Nabal does know who David is. In fact, he knows a whole lot about David. Right? Calling him a servant means he knows he used to work in Saul's household, and he knows his father's name. But this is all insults. Because Nabal himself is actually from a very powerful family line. He's actually descended from someone named Caleb. Just as a quick aside, if you remember back to the Exodus, way back in the Exodus, there were 10 spies who said we couldn't go in, and there were 2 who said, yes, we can go in. One of those spies was Caleb. So Nabal descends from one of the most famous people in Hebrew history. So that means that Nabal may have even inherited his wealth, but his name was a very important family line. David was nobody. So what's happening here is that a wealthy man from a good family line is calling out the fact that, son of Jesse? Jesse's a nobody. You're a son of nobody. So if you're a son of nobody, then you're nobody. And you're even more than nobody, you're just a servant who ran away from his master. So basically, Nabal's not just saying no. He is insulting David all the way through this response. And as we carry on, should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered from my shears and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where? So he just continues to insult David. Continues to say that David has no right to make this request, that he's nobody, that, I'm the provider, Nabal. I'm not responsible to provide to you. So David's men have to take this message back to David. And obviously, this is not the answer that David was looking for. So how is David going to respond to this? Now, we do know from last week that David has the ability to be level-headed. He has the ability to remember that his decisions will affect his story, right? Because when he had the chance to kill Saul, he didn't do it because he didn't want to have that smear on his story. So he seems like a guy who's got good self-control. So with all that in mind, let's see what happens here with David. David's first words, "Get your swords!" Was David's reply as he strapped on his own and took 400 men with him to go see Nabal and his men, leaving 200 behind to guard the equipment. What's David's response to that insult is, I'm going to kill Nabal, I'm going to kill everybody who works for him. A little bit out of scale. Right? The guy called you bad names, right? But it's not that bad. And what I would say is that David might just be having a bad day at this point. Right? Because although you might say that, well, in that culture, killing Nabal would be okay. Certainly, killing all the guys that you've been hanging out with all this time who've done nothing to you. So I think that if David was alive today, he'd be posting on Twitter this: "Today is not the day, and I am not the one." All right? So what it comes down to is that David has been a reasonable man at times. But clearly, he is not able to be reasonable right now. He's going to deal with this issue. But why? Why is the man who was so level-headed with Saul so just crazy with rage in this situation? What's going on? Well, I think it's a combination of pride and exhaustion. Right? David knows that he will be king one day, making him the most powerful man in his country. It means that everyone will have to answer to him and look up to him. And he's being reminded where he came from, and it's kind of tearing him down. Not that he came from a bad place, that's not it, but that's how he's feeling right now. His pride is damaged. And I think his pride is so vulnerable because he's so tired. He's been running for years. David runs a total of around 13 years, certainly over a decade he spends running. And what's been happening is that as you follow the exploits of David, David does a lot of good while he's on the run. In fact, we'll actually learn more about the good he did for the shepherds momentarily. But he's been doing a lot of good along the way. But he's tired, and he's sick of it. And he's sick of waiting, and he's sick of what he has to go through. And he's actually looking at his life and saying, it's all been wasted. It's all been wasted. All that good stuff I did doesn't matter at all now. I did all those good things, and I have to deal with this. It's just too much. I'm not putting up with it anymore. So if things continue the way they are, you got two men acting like idiots, right? You got Nabal, who's basically acted way out of scale. Nabal could have just said no, but he didn't. He had to sling insults when he said no. And you've got David, who feels that these insults justify murdering hundreds of people. We need someone who's got better sense than both of these guys do. Thankfully, that person is a woman named Abigail. Nabal. Nabal is married to a woman named Abigail, and she's actually described as a wise and intelligent woman. So the shepherds who work for Nabal know that Nabal's the problem, Abigail's the one who gets things done. So they basically sneak off and go see Abigail. And they tell her what happened. And they tell her that, David's request is actually very reasonable. We got to know those guys. They were good guys. They've been doing good things for us. So basically, what the shepherds tell Abigail is that these men, David's men, have been very good to us. And we never suffered any harm from them. Nothing was stolen from us the whole time they were with us. In other words, they understand that David and his men are warriors. They had the ability to take anything that they wanted from these shepherds. And they never did that. And it turns out they did more than not harm the shepherds. They actually protected the shepherds. Because if we carry on, in fact, day and night, they were like a wall of protection to us and the sheep. The thing we want to remember is that although David is a warrior now, where did he start? As a shepherd. He knows how hard the life of a shepherd is. He was uniquely qualified from his life experience to know how to care for and protect these shepherds. Because it's very easy for us to look at the shepherd as kind of someone who just kind of, hangs out with the sheep, not much to do. But remember that they're in a wilderness. Right? It's a desert, but it's a wilderness with wild animals. And they're in remote areas with bandits. And the shepherd's job is to protect the sheep. In fact, in that culture, it's possible that Nabal looked at the sheep as more valuable than the shepherds. So a shepherd could be killed by a wild animal. He could be robbed by bandits. He could be murdered by bandits. If bandits took a large number of sheep, the shepherd could be held accountable for that. And David understood all those things. So he made sure that his men protected the shepherds. The problem here is that David has lost sight of all that. David is so short-tempered because he's lost sight of the fact that God has placed him somewhere where he could do a form of good that someone else would have had more trouble with. You drop me in there, I don't know how to protect shepherds. Right? It's not going to happen. He knew how to do this. He knew what they were dealing with. But he'd lost sight of all that because he was getting tired. He feels like he's wasting his time. He's ready to be king. He's ready for the outcome. And he's lost sight of all the good that he's been doing along the way. Now, fortunately, Abigail, being wise as she is, understands what the problem is. Now, first of all, she knows there's no talking to Nabal. There's just no talking to Nabal. But he understands what he can do for David. He understands that if she can get David to remember what's important, David will calm down. And if she does that, she can save everyone. She can save Nabal, all the shepherds, potentially herself, depending on how things go. And she could keep David from making a mistake that would haunt him the rest of his life. So what Abigail does is that once she understands all this and what they were looking for, she basically loads up the supplies they asked for. So tons of food for the men, loads them up on a donkey, and she actually rides out to meet David. And one of the things that's so impressive about Abigail is that she understands not just what the problem is, but how the personality of David is affected in this. And you'll see she does these kind of really neat things to kind of reach David along the way. And we actually see her wisdom the second she encounters David. So as we read on, Abigail fell at David's feet and said, I accept all the blame, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. Please don't pay any attention to him. He's a fool, just as his name suggests. But I never even saw the young man you sent. So what's the first thing she does? She greets David like he's the king. She kneels before him. This isn't a male-female thing, a woman bowing before a man. This is a subject bowing before a king. She reminds David of the promise of his life, that you are going to be the king, and I'm going to greet you like the king. And then she affirms his request. What you asked for was totally reasonable, so I've brought it. It's here now. So she takes care of both those issues. And then she knows that, okay, I've greeted David as the king he will be. I've given him what he asked for. But his anger right now is at Nabal. And we have to deal with that as well. So basically she says that, don't pay attention to Nabal. He's an idiot. Right? He's a fool, right? He's an idiot. Don't talk to him. Talk to me. Had your request come to me, of course it would have been granted. It's completely reasonable. And then she reminds David of what's important, right? That he's going to be king, he needs to remember that, right? That he's still not officially king, and there's a lot of time that's going to pass between now and when he becomes king. But all that time matters. If he's going to be a good king, it's built on doing good all the way along the way. You have been doing good. Continue to do good. So Abigail then talks to David very directly. Here's what's at stake right now if you continue on the path you're planning to go on. When the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. Remember early in the series, we talked about regret. David was about to do something that there would be no coming back from. He was about to do something that was going to harm tons of innocent people. That's what's at stake right now. Don't let your pride cause you to do something that you cannot undo. Don't let the emotions of the moment cloud all the good that you've been doing along the way. Stay focused on doing good all along the way. You can't just jump to the end. This will not solve that. You will just have regret that you have to carry with you. And fortunately, Abigail is able to reach David, because David then goes on. Then David accepted her present and told her, return home in peace. I have heard what you said. I will not kill your husband. Now, I will not kill your husband is a good thing. Not committing murder, of course, is a good thing. Right? But if we really look at this in more general terms, what's happened here, and this is the thing we kind of keep touching on in the series, someone worthwhile spoke into David's life. David's own situation. In a vacuum, David let his emotions get a hold of him, and he lost sight of what was important. Abigail speaks into his life and explains to him what's at stake and what's going on. And David recognizes the wisdom of what she says, but he doesn't just recognize it, he actually responds to it. He actually changes his actions. He actually hears her and changes his direction to allow him to go forward in a better way. Now, this struggle of getting through the day-to-day and losing sight of the good we do is certainly not unique to David. In fact, this is a struggle that has gone on for all of mankind's existence. In fact, 1,000 years after David, the Apostle Paul is seeing this happening in an entire church. There's a church that has now lost sight of the importance of what they do each day. And they're losing sight of the good that they do. And in losing sight of the good that they do, they're about to kind of head off in a not good way. And so Paul, in a letter to them, makes one really key statement, that really summarizes exactly what Abigail was saying to David. What Paul wrote was, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we don't give up." In other words, what Paul's point is that, of course, we are working towards some end goal, right? We're trying to get to an end goal. But along that way, we're going to have a whole lot of life. And we need to keep doing good along the way. Don't get so focused on the end goal. Don't get so focused on your frustrations. Don't get so focused on the difficulties that A, you stop doing good, and B, you lose sight of the good that you have done. Because I know for me personally, if I reflect on times where I've been able to be a positive influence, help someone, do something for someone, it helps me to carry on. If I get focused only on my own journey, I can find that I get very frustrated. And so it's so important that we don't grow weary in doing good. And if we keep this all in mind, I think we all have to acknowledge that sometimes we're like David. Sometimes we lose sight of the importance of the good that we're doing. And if we're fortunate, someone we trust will point out the good that we have been doing and will encourage us to carry on and do the right thing, to continue to do good. And if we're able to build good relationships in our lives, we can also have the chance to be an Abigail. That we may also have the chance to speak into someone else's life and remind them of the good that they've been doing and to help them to stay encouraged as they go through their own personal journeys. So with all this in mind, I'd like to wrap up today with just a quick kind of wrap up of the whole series. With kind of 4 things I think we could all keep in mind as we go forward. And each one of these comes from a part of the series. So the first thing that we talked about in the series back in part 1 was this idea of doubt and mistakes. And I think it's really important that we all give ourselves and others room to have doubts and make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Right? We all have doubts along the way. We all have doubts about our faith sometimes. We have doubts about what I'm doing is the right thing. We have doubts about where we stand in a relationship. And we certainly make mistakes along the way and do things we wished we wouldn't have done. We've got to give ourselves room to do that. And we want to remember that with each day we can kind of start fresh. But sometimes our mistakes will lead to regrets. Right? But we don't want to let our regrets hold us back. Now, one of the best ways to do that is that when you've harmed someone, try to make restitution. We've talked about that before. Try to make things right if you can. But once you've addressed your regrets, move on from them. Leave them behind. Regret, if we focus on a regret, we will never get anywhere. We get stuck. Then remember that your story is written one decision at a time. Right? Goals are good things. We need to have goals. We need to build towards goals. But the end point is not the only thing that matters. Right? So we want to remember that all the decisions we make along the way are part of writing that story. And then finally, don't grow weary in doing good. The good you do each day really matters. It matters for you. It matters for the people in your lives. It matters to the people you don't even know that you get to do good things for. It's so important that we recognize that each day is a brand new day, a chance to do something new that day, to start fresh that day, and do the good we can. And if we do that, if we start each day with a new idea, a new attitude, a willingness to do the good we can, that gives us the foundation we need to build our story, to build a good story, and to create a good outcome. You join me as I pray? Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we pray, Lord, that our hearts are open to your guiding today, Lord. Lord, I pray that we would each hear the things you have for us, Lord. I pray for anyone here right now who's feeling just worn out from what they're dealing with. That if there's anyone here who just feels like, gosh, just another day like that again is more than I can stand. Lord, I pray that you would bring to mind for them the good things that they've done along the way, Lord. Lord, Lord, I pray that each person here would recall the good you've blessed them to do with their lives, Lord. I pray, Lord, that each of us here would recognize that you've given us unique abilities and unique opportunities. And you allow us to impact lives individually, Lord, and we would step into that. And we would just embrace the freshness and newness of each day that you give us, Lord. And that we would walk boldly in the direction you call us to, Lord, to touch lives, to do good. Lord, as we're pursuing the things and the goals and the success that we feel that you're leading us to, that we would do our best to walk with joy in each day, recognizing what you've allowed us to do, the good you're going to enable us to do, and just the important role we play in the lives of those around us. Lord, I praise you, Lord. I thank you for all you give us. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.